Sometimes the smallest act of kindness is the only thing holding a universe together. The night shift on Orion Spire was always quiet, the kind of quiet that made every sound echo down the polished titanium corridors, and Daniel Carter preferred it that way because when the executives and diplomats finally went back to their luxury suites, a janitor could do his job without anyone noticing him. He pushed his cleaning cart slowly past the medical wing, fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished floor like pale starlight, the smell of antiseptic hanging in the cool recycled air, and that was when he heard it. A small uneven breathing sound coming from one of the patient rooms, not loud, just enough to make a man stop walking. Daniel leaned through the open doorway and saw the child sitting alone on a diagnostic bed, a thin alien boy with pale blue skin and silver hair, his legs motionless beneath a thermal blanket, while a tray of spilled medicine bottles rolled slowly across the floor. The boy's hands were shaking so badly he couldn't pick them up. Daniel glanced down the hallway expecting a nurse or technician, but the corridor stayed empty, monitors humming softly against the walls, and for a moment he just stood there with his mop in one hand because the station had rules about janitors interfering with medical care. Then the child tried again to reach the medicine and knocked another bottle onto the floor. Daniel sighed under his breath, set the mop aside, and stepped into the room. "Hey there, kid," he said quietly, the way you talk to someone who's already scared enough. "Let's slow things down a second." The boy looked up with wide, glowing eyes, surprised that the human cleaner had spoken to him at all. Daniel crouched beside the bed, careful not to move too quickly, and began gathering the bottles one by one, setting them neatly back onto the tray before wiping the spilled liquid with a cloth from his pocket. Only after the floor was clean did he reach for the child's trembling hands. They were cold, lighter than he expected, and the shaking eased just a little when Daniel steadied them. "Easy," he murmured. "Just breathe for a minute." The boy tried, chest rising in shallow bursts until the rhythm slowly softened. Outside the room, a glass observation wall looked dark and empty, but behind that dark glass someone had been watching the entire moment unfold. High above the quiet medical wing, in a private monitoring lounge overlooking half the station, Lady Ilara Voss, the wealthiest alien investor in the Orion trade network, stood perfectly still as the security feed replayed the same scene again and again. The human janitor kneeling beside her disabled son, as if helping him were the most natural thing in the galaxy. She had hired specialists from 12 worlds to care for the child, and most of them lasted less than a week. Yet this man earning barely $12 an hour had walked into the room without hesitation, cleaned the floor, steadied the boy's hands, and spoken to him like he mattered. In the medical room, Daniel lifted a small toy starship from his cleaning cart, something he had fixed from the station's recycling bin earlier that night, and placed it gently beside the boy's pillow. The child stared at it in quiet wonder. Daniel just shrugged and returned to his mop, unaware that somewhere above him a billionaire was already asking a question that would change both their lives forever. The hallway outside the medical wing slowly returned to silence after Daniel Carter rolled his cleaning cart away, the soft squeak of its wheels fading into the long corridor, while the toy starship remained beside the alien child's pillow like a tiny promise made by accident. Inside the observation lounge 3 floors above, Lady Ilara Voss stood motionless in the dim light of a dozen holographic monitors, each one replaying the same quiet moment from a different angle as the human janitor knelt beside her son and steadied the boy's trembling hands with a patience none of the hired specialists had shown. The room around her was larger than most apartments on the station, its glass walls revealing a slow swirl of stars outside Orion Spire. Yet her attention never left the security feed, where the boy named Lyran now examined the small starship with cautious fascination. Ilara folded her arms, silver rings catching the blue glow of the screens, and for a moment the most powerful investor in the Orion trade network looked less like a billionaire and more like a mother trying to solve a problem no amount of money had fixed. For 2 years she had purchased every treatment, every advanced therapy, every specialist recommended by the most respected medical guilds across 12 systems, and still her son's legs remained motionless, and his fragile nervous system left him exhausted after the smallest effort. Caretakers arrived confident and left defeated, some politely resigning, others quietly requesting transfers. And yet, tonight a man earning barely $12 an hour had walked into the room, without hesitation, and spoken to Lyran as if nothing about him was unusual. Elira tapped a command into the console and the camera zoomed closer, revealing Lyran slowly pushing the toy starship across the blanket while whispering something too soft for the microphones to capture. That alone made her pause because the boy rarely spoke to strangers. A faint vibration from the door signaled someone entering the lounge, and a tall alien physician stepped inside, holding a data tablet against his chest. Dr. Viral had overseen Lyran's care for months, and his expression carried the careful calm of someone trained never to promise more than science could deliver. He glanced at the monitors and immediately recognized the scene playing across them. "Is that the human sanitation worker?" he asked, voice measured. Elira nodded once without looking away from the screen. "Daniel Carter," she said quietly as if testing the name for the first time. The doctor studied the image of the janitor's earlier actions and then exhaled softly. "Interaction outside authorized medical staff is not recommended," he explained with professional caution. "Human biological contact could introduce variables we cannot predict." Elira finally turned from the screen, her pale blue eyes reflecting the starfield beyond the glass. "Variables," she repeated thoughtfully, then gestured toward the recording where Lyran now held the toy ship with both hands, his breathing calm for the first time that evening. "It seems the variables are the only thing that helped him tonight." Dr. Viral hesitated, because the data on the monitor clearly supported her observation. Down in the quiet medical room, Lyran carefully placed the small starship beside his pillow and looked toward the doorway, as if expecting the janitor to return. Far down the corridor, Daniel Carter had already resumed mopping the polished floor, unaware that his simple act of kindness had just become the center of a conversation among the most powerful people on the station, and that somewhere above him Lady Elira Voss had already decided she needed to meet the man who treated her son like he mattered. Daniel Carter finished the last stretch of the corridor just before midnight, guiding the wide microfiber mop across the polished floor until the overhead lights reflected like a sheet of quiet water, and when he leaned on the handle for a second his back reminded him that 42 years of gravity, long shifts, and cheap station coffee were beginning to add up. Orion Spire never truly slept, but the medical wing at this hour felt almost peaceful, the distant hum of ventilation systems mixing with the soft pulse of monitoring equipment behind closed doors. Daniel pushed the cart forward again, checking the small digital list clipped to the handle, room numbers blinking one by one as his routine carried him back toward the patient corridor he had passed earlier. He did not expect anything unusual, because janitors on a station this large learned quickly that the best nights were the boring ones. When he reached the door where the blue-skinned boy rested, the room light was dimmed too. A soft amber glow, and the child was awake, lying still beneath the blanket, while turning the tiny starship slowly in his hands as if studying every panel and wing. Daniel paused in the doorway for half a second, unsure if he should interrupt, but the boy noticed him immediately and lifted the toy a little higher. "You fixed it," the child said quietly, his voice thin but clear. Daniel stepped inside again and rested his cleaning cloth on the edge of the cart. "Found it in a recycling bin," he answered with a small shrug. "Someone tossed it out because the stabilizer fin was loose." Lyran looked down at the ship with a seriousness that belonged on someone much older. "It flies in stories," the boy said. Daniel nodded slowly as he began wiping a small table beside the bed, careful not to disturb the medical instruments. "Everything flies in stories," he replied. "Sometimes that is enough." The boy watched him work for a moment before asking the question that children everywhere eventually ask when they notice something different. "Why are you helping me?" Daniel paused with the cloth in his hand, thinking about the simplest answer he could give without sounding like a lecture. He finished cleaning the table, folded the cloth once, and leaned lightly on the cart. "Because you looked like you needed help," he said, voice calm and steady. Lyran seemed to accept that explanation with surprising ease, returning his attention to the starship as if that answer made perfect sense. Above them, hidden cameras captured the entire conversation in clear silence, and in the observation lounge Lady Elira Voss watched the screen with a quiet intensity that none of her advisors would have recognized. She noticed the way Daniel never spoke loudly, the way he moved slowly around the fragile equipment, the way Lyran's shoulders relaxed when the human was nearby. Dr. Viral stood beside her studying the same footage with professional curiosity. The boy appears calmer, he admitted carefully. Elira folded her hands behind her back, while the stars drifted beyond the glass walls. Calmer, she repeated softly as if the word itself carried weight. On the screen, Daniel lifted the mop again and began cleaning the floor near the door, treating the task with the same focus he gave every room on the station. Lyran watched him go, holding the tiny ship against his chest like it was something far more valuable than scrap metal. And for the first time since arriving on Orion Spire, Lady Elira Voss made a quiet decision that had nothing to do with profit, investment, or power, because the next time Daniel Carter walked into that corridor, the most powerful woman on the station intended to be waiting there. Morning on Orion Spire did not arrive with sunlight, only with the gradual brightening of the station lights, as the artificial day cycle shifted from deep blue to soft white across the long corridors. And Daniel Carter felt the change the way every night shift worker did, like the quiet signal that another 12-hour shift was almost over. He pushed his cleaning cart past the medical wing once more, moving slowly because the wheels had begun to squeak again, and he made a mental note to oil them later in the maintenance room. Most of the patient doors were closed now, and the hallway smelled faintly of sterilizer and fresh air from the station filtration system. But one door stood open exactly where he remembered it. Inside the room, Lyran was awake again, propped slightly higher on the diagnostic bed, while carefully guiding the small starship across the blanket like it was navigating an invisible galaxy. When the boy noticed Daniel standing in the doorway, his expression brightened in a quiet way that children sometimes do when they recognize someone safe. "You came back," Lyran said softly. Daniel smiled and leaned the mop against the wall before stepping inside with the relaxed patience of someone who had spent years working around people who needed calm more than conversation. "I work this hallway every night," he explained while adjusting a chair that had been pushed slightly out of place. "So I guess you were stuck seeing me." For a while, the boy considered that and nodded as if it sounded perfectly reasonable. He lifted the toy ship again and pointed toward the ceiling lights glowing above the room. "If it had real engines, it could leave the station," Lyran said. Daniel followed the direction of the toy and chuckled quietly. "Every ship starts as an idea first," he replied while wiping the edge of the bedside table. "Someone imagines it flying long before the engineers build it." Lyran seemed to think about that for several seconds before placing the starship carefully beside his pillow again. Outside the room, footsteps approached along the corridor, steady and deliberate, and Daniel assumed it was another medical technician beginning the morning rotation. He picked up the mop and began cleaning the corner near the door, without paying much attention to the approaching figure. The footsteps stopped just outside the doorway, and for a moment the room fell completely silent except for the faint hum of monitoring equipment. Daniel glanced up politely, expecting a nurse, but instead he found himself looking at a tall woman with pale blue skin and silver hair that reflected the corridor lights like polished metal. Her clothing was simple yet unmistakably elegant, the kind worn by people whose time was far more valuable than the objects around them. Daniel straightened slightly, unsure why someone like her would be standing in a patient room at this hour. Lyran noticed her too and lifted his head from the pillow with quiet recognition. The woman stepped inside slowly, her eyes moving first to the small starship beside the boy, and then to the human janitor holding a mop near the door. For several seconds, she said nothing at all, simply observing the room with calm attention. Then she looked directly at Daniel Carter and spoke in a voice soft enough to match the quiet of the medical wing. "You are the one who repaired the toy," she said. Daniel nodded once, still unsure who she was. The woman studied him for another moment before adding a sentence that would soon make the entire station feel very different. "I have been watching you." Daniel Carter held the mop quietly at his side for a moment after the blue-skinned woman spoke, because there was something in her calm voice that made the entire room feel different, like the air itself had slowed down. He glanced once at the corridor behind her, expecting security or hospital staff to appear, but the hallway remained empty and silent under the soft white station lights. "Watching me?" Daniel repeated politely, not defensive, just confused in the honest way people often are when someone important suddenly steps into an ordinary moment. The woman stepped farther into the room, her movements smooth and controlled, the polished floor reflecting the faint silver shimmer of her long hair. Lyran watched both of them with quiet curiosity while holding the small starship carefully against his chest, as if it were something fragile. The woman's eyes moved briefly toward the toy before. Returning to Daniel. "You repaired it," she said again, this time with a hint of approval. Daniel nodded once and rested his hand on the cleaning cart. "It was broken," he explained simply, as if that alone answered the question. The woman studied his face for a few seconds, measuring something unspoken. Then she looked toward the bed where the boy lay. "Lyran," she said gently, and the child's expression shifted with immediate recognition. Daniel noticed the change and realized the obvious truth at the same moment the boy spoke. "Mother," Lyran said quietly. The words settled into the room like a small revelation. Daniel straightened slightly, understanding now that the elegant stranger standing beside his mop bucket was not just a visitor, but the child's parent. The woman turned back toward him with the same composed posture she had carried since entering. "My name is Varavas," she said. The name meant nothing to Daniel for exactly half a second, and then memory connected the pieces because even janitors heard conversations drifting through the corridors of a major trade station. Varavas was one of the wealthiest investors in the Orion trade network, a name mentioned whenever station expansions, shipping routes, or billion credit construction deals were discussed. Daniel blinked once, processing that information while trying not to appear surprised. He lifted the mop slightly, as if remembering why he was standing there. "Nice to meet you, ma'am," he said with a small respectful nod. Elira watched his reaction carefully, because most people who recognized her either became nervous or overly polite. Yet the human janitor simply returned to wiping a small section of the floor beside the bed, as though the presence of a powerful billionaire did not change his routine at all. Lyran seemed amused by the situation and held up the toy starship toward his mother. "He fixed it," the boy repeated proudly. Elira examined the tiny craft for a moment before looking again at Daniel. "I noticed," she replied softly. There was a long pause while the quiet machines around the room continued their steady rhythm. Finally she spoke again, this time with a tone that carried quiet curiosity instead of authority. "You work a long shift," she said. Daniel gave a small shrug while guiding the mop across the polished floor. 12 hours most nights," he answered. Elira tilted her head slightly, as if calculating something invisible. "And yet you still had time to help a child who was not your responsibility," she said. Daniel rinsed the mop in the cart bucket and glanced toward Lyran with an easy smile. "Sometimes responsibility is just whoever is standing closest," he replied. The room became very still after that answer, and for the first time since entering, Elira Voss looked at the human janitor not as a worker on her station, but as a puzzle she suddenly wanted to understand. The silence after Daniel Carter's answer lingered in the room longer than anyone expected, the quiet hum of the station equipment filling the space, while Lady Voss studied the human janitor as though she had just encountered a language she did not yet understand. Lyran lay comfortably against his pillow, the small starship resting in his hands while he slowly guided it through the air above the blanket, making gentle turns as if imagining distant galaxies beyond the walls of Orion's spire. Daniel returned the mop to the bucket and squeezed out the water with practiced movements, the routine of his work steady and unhurried, because to him this was still just another hallway and another patient room. Elira stepped closer to the bed, her gaze softening slightly when Lyran lifted the toy toward her again. "He says it flies," the boy explained quietly. Elira accepted the small ship and examined the carefully repaired stabilizer fin, noticing the tiny screw that had been tightened by hand rather than by precision tool. She looked back at Daniel with thoughtful curiosity. "You repaired this with station scrap?" she asked. Daniel nodded lightly while adjusting the cleaning cloth on his cart. "Maintenance bins throw away plenty of useful things," he said. "Sometimes they just need someone patient enough to put them back together." Lyran smiled faintly at that and guided the ship through another imaginary loop above the blanket once his mother handed it back. The moment felt simple, almost ordinary. Yet Elira knew nothing about it was ordinary because her son had not spoken this calmly to a stranger in months. Dr. Viral's medical reports had described increasing anxiety and fatigue, but now the boy's breathing was slow and steady while the human janitor stood only a few feet away. Elira folded her hands together thoughtfully before speaking again. "You understand that he is ill," she said quietly. Daniel looked toward Lyran for a moment before answering. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I can see that." Elira watched his face carefully. "Most people avoid situations they cannot fix," she continued, "especially when the problem belongs to someone else." Daniel leaned the mop against the wall again and rested his hands on the card handle. "Maybe," he replied gently, "but sometimes people do not need something fixed right away." He glanced toward Lyran, who was now carefully landing the toy starship beside his pillow like a pilot completing a careful landing. "Sometimes they just need someone nearby who is not afraid of the problem." The words were simple, but they settled into the room with quiet weight. Elira did not respond immediately, because for years she had tried to solve every difficulty with resources, specialists, or advanced technology. And yet this human janitor with no authority and no medical training had approached her son with nothing more than patience. She turned slightly toward the doorway, as if considering something far larger than the room itself. Outside, the corridor had begun to brighten with the full daylight cycle of the station. Workers passing occasionally in the distance as Orion's spire slowly woke for another busy day of trade and travel. Inside the medical room, Lyran closed his eyes for a moment, still holding the starship close to his chest. Elira noticed the calm expression on his face and then looked once more at Daniel Carter. "Tell me something," she said quietly, her voice carrying the curiosity of someone used to understanding every variable in a negotiation. "Why does a human janitor care this much about a child he met only yesterday?" Daniel Carter did not answer immediately when Lady Elira Voss asked her question, because the way she asked it made the room feel less like a hospital chamber and more like a quiet place where someone was trying to understand something that had never made sense before. The soft glow of the station lights reflected across the polished floor, while Lyran lay calmly on the bed with the small starship resting against his chest, his breathing slow and even in a way the medical monitors had rarely recorded. Daniel rested his hands lightly on the handle of his cleaning cart and glanced toward the boy for a moment, as if making sure he was comfortable before speaking. "Where I come from," Daniel said gently. "People do not usually start by asking if someone deserves help." Elira tilted her head slightly, the movement subtle but attentive. Daniel continued in the same steady voice he had used since stepping into the room hours earlier. "Sometimes a kid drops something, and you pick it up. Sometimes someone looks scared, and you stay nearby until they are not anymore." He gave a small shrug as though the explanation required nothing complicated. "It is not really about knowing them first." Elira listened carefully, because his answer did not match the logical framework she had learned through years of negotiation, economics, and strategy. Most people in her world calculated outcomes before acting, yet the human janitor seemed to move through the situation guided by something far simpler. Lyran opened his eyes slightly and looked between the two adults while slowly rotating the toy starship in his hands. The tiny metal wings caught the light like a real spacecraft crossing distant stars. "He talks to me like I am normal," Lyran said quietly. Daniel looked over and smiled with an easy warmth. "You are normal," he replied. "You just have a different set of problems than most pilots." The boy smiled faintly at that idea and pretended to guide the starship through another gentle turn. Elira watched the exchange with an expression that softened almost imperceptibly because it had been a long time since she had seen her son respond so naturally to anyone outside the medical staff. She stepped closer to the bed and rested one hand lightly on the railing, her voice thoughtful when she spoke again. "You realize that my resources could provide you with a far easier life than this one," she said, glancing briefly at the mop bucket and the worn handle of the cart. Daniel followed her gaze and chuckled quietly. "Maybe," he admitted. "But easier does not always mean better." He reached down and adjusted the blanket near Lyran's shoulder so it would not slide off the bed. "Besides," he added calmly, "someone has to keep the floors clean." The answer was so simple that it left the room silent again for several seconds. Elira studied the human in front of her, noticing the calm patience in the way he moved, the lack of hesitation in his voice, and the fact that he had never once asked for recognition or reward. Outside the doorway, the morning activity of Orion's spire had begun to grow louder as distant footsteps and passing service carts echoed through the corridor. Inside the room, Lyran carefully landed the toy starship beside his pillow again and looked toward Daniel with quiet trust. Lyra saw that trust clearly now, and for the first time she began to understand that the most valuable thing the janitor had given her son was not technology or treatment, but something far rarer. After a moment she turned toward Daniel again and spoke with calm certainty. "Then perhaps," she said slowly, "you should spend more time in this hallway than cleaning it." Daniel Carter blinked once when Lady Uravas finished speaking, because her suggestion did not sound like a request, and it did not sound like a command either. It sounded like the beginning of something he had not expected to hear while holding a mop in a quiet hospital room. The soft daylight cycle of Orion's spire now filled the corridor outside, casting pale reflections across the polished floor, while distant station traffic created a low, steady murmur far beyond the medical wing. Daniel rested one hand on the handle of his cleaning cart and looked briefly at Lyran, who was carefully guiding the toy starship through the air again as though testing invisible currents. "Ma'am," Daniel said calmly, "I am pretty sure the station hired me to clean the hallway, not supervise it." Lyra watched him with a thoughtful expression that carried none of the impatience many executives displayed when their ideas were questioned. "The station hired you for maintenance," she replied, "but I am the primary investor who funded this entire medical wing." Daniel absorbed that information quietly, not because the statement surprised him, but because the way she said it felt less like a display of power and more like someone adjusting the pieces of a problem. Lyran shifted slightly on the bed and looked between them with interest, the starship resting lightly in his hands. "He could stay," the boy said softly, as if the decision were very simple. Daniel chuckled under his breath and leaned the mop against the wall again so it would not slide. "I am not much of a doctor," he said. Lyra shook her head slightly. "That is exactly why I am speaking to you," she answered. She stepped closer to the window where the faint glow of the passing starfield filtered through the transparent wall panels and then looked back toward him. "For 2 years I have hired the best specialists from multiple worlds," she continued calmly. "Yet none of them have given my son the thing he showed tonight." Daniel frowned slightly, trying to understand what she meant. Lyra glanced toward the bed where Lyran had just completed another imaginary flight and carefully landed the small starship beside his pillow. The boy's face carried a calm that had been missing from the medical reports Daniel had glimpsed earlier on the monitor screens. "Peace," Lyra said quietly. The words settled into the room like a small truth. Daniel shifted his weight slightly and rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. "I just talked to him," he replied. Lyra met his eyes with steady focus. "Exactly," she said. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses because now the idea had taken shape between them. Outside the corridor, a group of station staff walked past without noticing the unusual conversation happening inside the room. Lyran watched Daniel expectantly, his fingers resting on the metal wings of the repaired starship. Finally Daniel exhaled slowly and looked back at Lyra. "Even if I stayed longer," he said gently, "I am still just a janitor." Lyra allowed the faintest smile to appear at the corner of her expression, the kind that suggested she had already anticipated the answer. "On this station," she said calmly, "positions can change faster than most people realize." She paused long enough for the meaning to settle before adding one final sentence that made Daniel Carter realize this conversation was no longer theoretical, "which is why I would like to offer you a different job." Daniel Carter stood quietly beside his cleaning cart after Lady Uravas finished speaking, the soft morning light of Orion's spire reflecting across the polished floor while the meaning of her words settled slowly in his mind. The corridor outside had grown busier now as station workers moved between shifts, yet inside the medical room everything remained calm and still. Daniel glanced toward Lyran, who was gently moving the small starship through the air again, the repaired wings catching the light as if the toy truly belonged among the distant stars beyond the station windows. "A different job," Daniel repeated carefully, because it sounded less like an opportunity and more like a decision that had already been considered from every angle. Lyra nodded once, her posture relaxed but certain. "My son requires more than medical supervision," she said quietly. "He needs someone who treats him as a person first and a patient second." Daniel looked down at the mop leaning against the wall and then back at the boy on the bed. You have an entire medical team for that, he replied. Elira folded her hands gently together and allowed a faint smile to appear. I have a medical team for treatment, she explained. But what he responded to last night was not treatment. She glanced toward Lyran, whose eyes were half closed in a peaceful kind of concentration, while he imagined the small starship exploring distant worlds. He responded to you. Daniel scratched the back of his neck. Thoughtfully, the way someone does when they are trying to find a reason to say no without sounding disrespectful. Ma'am, I clean floors, he said. I am not trained to care for children. Lyran opened one eye and spoke before Elira could answer. You already did, the boy said softly. Daniel chuckled under his breath at that simple observation. Elira stepped closer to the bed and rested one hand lightly on the rail while looking at Daniel again. The position would be simple, she continued. Spend time here during your shifts, talk with him, help keep his mind occupied when the treatments become exhausting. Daniel looked around the quiet room, the medical monitors, the bright corridor beyond the doorway, and finally the small starship resting in Lyran's hands. He thought about the long nights pushing a mop down empty hallways and the brief moment yesterday when the frightened child had calmed simply because someone stayed nearby. After a few seconds, he exhaled slowly and gave a small nod. I suppose the hallway will stay clean whether I finish 10 minutes early or not, he said. Lyran's face brightened immediately while Elira regarded the human janitor with an expression that carried genuine gratitude for the first time since entering the room. Then we have an agreement, she said softly. Daniel picked up the mop again out of habit and guided it once across the final section of floor near the door before placing it back into the cart. When he turned around, Lyran held the toy starship toward him again. Captain Carter, the boy said with a quiet smile. Ready for launch. Daniel laughed quietly and took the small ship for a moment before returning it to the boy's hands. Outside the window, the stars drifted slowly past Orion Spire like silent witnesses to the ordinary moment. Because sometimes in a galaxy full of powerful people and advanced technology, the thing that changed everything was simply a human who stopped long enough to be kind.